you ever thought about using equity crowdfunding to raise money for your company? Have you even heard of it? Or maybe you've heard of equity crowdfunding and thought maybe it would be a good place for you to invest in startups. But maybe you don't know what are all the pros and cons. Great questions. Let's jump in. That's why I made this video, just for you to answer those exact questions. And if you stay to the end, I'll give you one more question that you should be asking yourself before investing your time, energy, or money into equity crowdfunding. All right, so let's go through some of the pros and cons of equity crowdfunding. There's obviously the biggest pro, which is raising money, right? And with equity crowdfunding, you can raise up to $5 million a year from non-accredited investors, which is great. And it's flexible enough that you can raise more money from institutional investors outside of your equity crowdfunding campaign. So a lot of really great companies will run 2 campaigns at the same time. They'll go out and they'll raise money from venture capitalists, and then they'll open up some of the funding round that they've put together for retail investors to participate alongside them, thereby adding kind of a differentiated investor onto the cap table. Another benefit that I love to tout is that you turn your customers into advocates. And this is super important if you are selling a consumer product business, right? Where word of mouth is super valuable. But guess what? It even can be valuable if what you're doing is selling enterprise software. Because think about it this way. If just one of your investors becomes a customer or refers you to a customer, and that customer ends up spending $100,000 on an enterprise software contract, you will more than make back any of the money that it cost you to raise on an equity crowdfunding platform. The other thing that I think is valuable here too is that it gives you this really great PR story. So depending on your brand and your company and what you're trying to do, there can be a lot of value in saying, hey, we're going to do this equity crowdfunding campaign because we want to empower the retail investor to be able to participate alongside us and participate alongside the rich and capture the gains of our company and make money just like the rich do, right? That can be a really empowering story that you can get a lot of runway out of from a PR perspective, especially if your brand is something like, hey, we've built a product for some underserved community, and then you go out and you allow people in that underserved community to become investors in your company and ride your success, right? Okay, and then one of the last and biggest pros, in my opinion, of raising money from equity crowdfunding as opposed to venture capital is that oftentimes VCs will look at deals and they'll be like, nah, this isn't really like a venture deal. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad business. It could still be a phenomenal business and one worth investing in. And so equity crowdfunding can be that kind of platform for retail investors who say, you know what? I still believe this, right? I can get conviction. I'm going to invest. I'll give you some relevant examples. So when Oculus first went out, they met with a bunch of VCs and the VCs turned them down. They were like, virtual reality is not a thing, blah, blah, blah. So then what they did is they went to Kickstarter. And even though that's not equity crowdfunding, this was before equity crowdfunding existed, they launched their product on Kickstarter and it became one of the most successful of all time, even to this date. After their success on Kickstarter, the company ended up selling for over $1 billion to Facebook. A massive home run for the founders and for the early investors that actually believed in the company. And Oculus exists today as a company within Facebook selling Oculus devices all over the world. Another good example is I met with this woman who raised money on one of the equity crowdfunding sites, and she had a vending machine that was built for mothers. So it had just what you would expect: diapers, formula, bottles, binkies, all kinds of stuff, right? Built for mothers who were traveling and maybe forgot something or ran out of some supply. And look, that kind of business would be really tough probably for a venture capitalist to invest in. They would look at it and say, well, these vending machines are really expensive and you got to service them and you got to fill them and it doesn't feel very scalable and it feels like a really niche market. But here's the thing, her business was doing incredibly well. She had lots of these vending machines placed at different airports and people were loving them. They were buying a lot of product and she was generating profits on each vending machine. And so even though it wasn't a fit for venture capitalists, it didn't mean that it was a terrible, horrible idea. She was able to take her idea to these equity crowdfunding platforms and raise money from non-VCs and still be able to grow her business. So these different platforms can be incredibly effective if venture capital isn't really the right route for you and you're too early stage to get money from banks. So lots of good reasons to do equity crowdfunding. Let's hit on some of the cons, reasons why you might not want to do it. So one of the big things is it's a lot of work, right? You're basically selling your company as a product, right? If it's hard enough to sell your product, imagine having to sell your product plus your company, because that's essentially what's happening with equity crowdfunding. And so you really are looking for people that are believers in you, and you want to get a lot of them, because some people only write $100 checks. But every once in a while, you can get somebody that will write a $10,000, $25,000 check, and that's pretty meaningful, right? And those are people that maybe you wouldn't have been able to tap into without doing equity crowdfunding. So there are pros and cons there. Another con is that you're going to have to disclose information about your company, about your traction, your financials, maybe not all the inner secrets of how you operate as a business, but frankly, a lot of them. And that can be really terrifying for a lot of entrepreneurs that want to keep everything close to the chest and everything confidential so their competitors don't figure it out. In my opinion, this is usually not that big of a deal, largely because, in my opinion, the ideas are a dime a dozen. It's execution that matters. Even if your competitors learn a lot about your business from your equity crowdfunding campaign, probably not going to give them enough information to be a real competitive threat to you outside of the normal reasons why they're competing against you. The other thing is, when you do equity crowdfunding, you are bringing on a lot of investors, which means you kind of have to manage a lot of investors. Now, these equity crowdfunding platforms like Start Engine and others are really good at helping you manage communication with all these investors. But nonetheless, right, when you're raising the money, you're going to get hundreds of questions from people. And if you want to do it well, you got to answer all those questions. And then going forward, like, these investors are going to want to know how the company is performing. They're going to reach out, and some of them might kind of pester you more than you would like them to. So there are a lot of trade-offs from that perspective in terms of just herding all of these cats. That said, if you go through one of the major platforms, they do a really good job, in my opinion, of helping you manage all of those different retail investors. And then the last thing that I want to just touch on is that raising on an equity crowdfunding platform can be a bit of a bad signal. So what I mean by that is, just like the pro being that you can raise money on equity crowdfunding if it's harder to raise it from venture capitalists will sometimes look at this and say, hey, you raise money on equity crowdfunding. Did you do that because you couldn't raise it from a traditional VC, right? Was your company just not good enough or strong enough? And so it can kind of have a negative connotation. The flip side of that is that is changing. More and more top-tier companies are raising on equity crowdfunding platforms, and they're doing incredibly well, generating great returns. And in fact, a lot of VCs are kind of jealous because they're seeing these retail investors be able to get into deals that they wish they could get into. So I don't know that I would allow that to hold me back from listing on one of the platforms and doing equity crowdfunding, but it is something you should be aware of. Like, the status quo today, if you're a top-tier entrepreneur, is not to raise money on equity crowdfunding. It's to go the traditional route of raising seed and venture capital. But that doesn't mean that I think, especially over the next few years, that it's going to be viewed as a negative, especially if you have a really good reason for doing it, such as building out your customer base into a group of super loyal and super loud, hopefully, advocates for your brand and platform. So anyways, those are some of the pros and cons as I see them for raising equity crowdfunding. All in all, I think for the right companies, it can be the right choice. And it can represent kind of this new way of raising money that a lot of people don't really think about or realize, that comes with a lot of really strong benefits. If you like this video, check out some of my others, like how to get into venture capital without any experience.